Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. I'm sure that many of our listeners are probably avid hunters or bird watchers as well as anglers, and you may have thought in the past, how do I get ducks to come to my favorite fishing hole? Well, today you're in luck. Today we are discussing management activities for ducks that are compatible with fisheries management. These are activities that you can do in your private lake or pond to encourage waterfowl to visit, either for viewing or for hunting purposes. My guests today are experts in the duck management realm. First off, I've got Dr. Brian Davis, who is currently the James C. Kennedy Endowed Professor in Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation at Mississippi State University. Before that, he was with Ducks Unlimited. And I have James Callicutt, who is currently an extension instructor, but has worked both with the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks and Ducks Unlimited as a waterfowl biologist. Brian and James, how are you guys doing today?
Good to be with you.
Yeah, doing great.
We're here today to talk about managing ponds to promote ducks, but we need to get something off my chest right away, and that is duck management and fisheries management, they're not perfectly compatible, right? I mean, the way we manage for, say, trophy bass or trophy bluegill usually is not productive for attracting ducks, and vice versa. The way you guys might manage a flooded field or a flooded forest for ducks is not perfectly compatible for fish. So we just need to understand that when we're talking today, we're talking about ways to improve duck habitat in fishing ponds, but don't have unrealistic expectations, because you're not likely to go out and shoot a couple limits of greenheads in the morning and then go out and catch a couple of double-digit bass in the afternoon on one very small body of water. A bigger lake, yeah, that might be possible. So as long as we have those sidebars and expectations, I think we'll be able to talk about ways that folks can actually improve upon duck habitat in ponds. So let me just ask you guys this question to start off. What makes awesome duck habitat?
The main thing that we manage for here in the South, particularly, we're mostly focused on the winter period when birds have migrated down here, and most of that is really centered around foraging habitat, providing food resources for them, but then also, in addition to that, cover for those birds to meet different biological needs they have as well. So food and cover kind of seem to be some of the more primary things that we're managing for. And so what that looks like, the type of wetlands that those are, there's a lot of different wetland types that ducks use, like you said, from flooded fields like agricultural fields to more natural grass, sedge type wetlands to forested wetlands, flooded timber and beaver wetlands. And so all those different wetland types provide different food resources. So some that have more higher energy for ducks than others that they need during different conditions. Like as it gets colder, they're going to switch to more high energy foods. And then, of course, as they move on through the winter, as they're pairing up, finding a mate is another thing, in addition to just feeding throughout the winter that they're needing to accomplish. And so, they choose habitats, particularly mallards use maybe those forested wetlands to have a little bit more of that structure where they can get isolated and strengthen those pair bonds. And also, too, their food needs switch. Like I said, as the winter kind of presses on and they start to switch more towards spring, things like the bugs out there, the aquatic invertebrates, that protein source becomes more important as they're molting and maybe subsequent egg production down the line. So main thing that those type of resources, food and cover, are the primary things that we're really trying to manage for. What that looks like varies on the type of wetlands that we're talking about, the time of the year, and the biological needs of the birds, and the landscape around where we're managing. What piece is around and what piece can you maybe provide that's missing? There's a a lot of variety in waterfowl habitat during winter, but that's kind of our main charge, is providing those adequate food and cover resources.
Yeah, I would add that maybe just start and kind of back it up a little bit for the landowners, especially. There's basically two types of food. There's plant and animal food, and plant food can be various things. It could be the green browse, the leaf matter. It could be the roots or tubers that they produce, or they could be seeds. And so, and in the animal matter, like James had mentioned, there's aquatic invertebrates, and there's all kinds of invertebrates. I mean, from spiders and little red worms that turn into chironomids to water beetles, all kinds of things. So there's basically, when we look kind of the 1,000-foot view, there's animal and plant food. And then there's, as James mentioned, some of the wetland types. There's some that we think of as really a lot more seasonal. And then there's those that we consider more semi-permanent or permanent. So when you think about, the word pond sort of evokes this semi-permanent or permanent habitat. So we think about seasonal habitats. Typically, we're talking about moist soil type seasonal herbaceous wetlands that are drained in the spring and the summer. And what makes waterfowl food, some of it really, really productive and available, is that a lot of those foods grow on mud flats in the summertime. So then they produce seed, the seed chatters, and then we flood them shallowly in fall and winter at variable times, depending on, our management objectives and hunting and things like that. So it's a little bit different from ponds, again, that are maybe a little bit more permanent or semi-permanent. And the other thing I'll say about the plant food, especially in ponds, we may be dealing with a lot more of the green matter, the stems, the submerged aquatic plants versus, weeds that grow annually and produce these seeds that birds basically will pick out of the mud or off the bottom of the substrate when it's flooded.
No, thanks, Brian. I think that really helps to understand how the duck manager thinks about managing to promote more ducks. As you said, ponds are quite a bit different from that. We don't always have the opportunity to flood new lands or flood forest. We don't necessarily want extremely abundant aquatic vegetation in most of the pond, which is what the ducks prefer. So, a lot of times we're talking about deeper water, not shallow water that the ducks can easily feed on the bottom. So really that's the big difference is that a pond is, or at least a recreational fishing pond, generally has an average depth that's substantially deeper than what you would be trying to flood for, say, a duck impound. So how does the pond owner, the recreational fishing pond owner, go about trying to make their fishing pond a little more duck friendly?
Well, I've had this question asked me a lot back in some of my older previous positions. I've done a fair amount of site visits with landowners and some that have, fishing ponds and have asked about that. There may be other elements of their portions of their property that are managed for ducks, but how can I get, is there anything I can do on my pond? Some birds are using it. What can I do to get more birds to use it? And I think it plays, Wes, real well into some of those things that you mentioned, those issues there of like Brian was saying, the types of plants that we manage for, the way we do that and on a 100% kind of duck objective is not always going to line up real well with managing that fish pond, because the way we promote those plants, we're drawing water down to create those mud flat conditions that Brian mentioned to promote the conditions for those plants that we like to see, or in those deeper places, doing activities that kind of encourage the growth of those submerged aquatics or floating plants that ducks really like. And I can imagine that a lot of those don't line up with like coontail or duckweed or pondweed or something like that we're trying to promote for gadwall or something. May not be cover that you want to have for your fish habitat. So there's some kind of competing objectives, and also on the shallower end, lowering those water levels to be able to grow those grass and sedge and herbaceous type plants is also that water level manipulation is not going to line up real well, with some of those fish objectives too. What we do most of the time with working with landowners is like managing expectations and kind of finding some balance between where their priority objectives line up. So can we do some kind of happy medium between these two things, or are we shifting to one of those objectives over the other.
Yeah, and you mentioned water level management. In the fisheries world, it's much more common to do a water level draw down in the wintertime when the ducks are showing up, because then what you're doing is you're concentrating the prey, allowing the bass that remain to eat the prey, help generate faster growth on the prey and faster growth from the bass because the bass are getting lots of food. And at the same time, that's helping to dry out the shorelines, expose them to drying and freezing to control aquatic vegetation. So it's kind of
it's on the flip.
Completely the opposite of what the duck manager's trying to do. So that's why I tried to set those realistic expectations in the beginning. That being said, you do have the potential to raise pond level in the wintertime, flood some terrestrial vegetation, or even planted agricultural crops for ducks. It's not necessarily something that can't be done in a pond setting, but it's kind of counter to what we've done in the past.
That seems to be the challenge. It's, because we're going to be wanting to do that drawdown in that spring, summer time period, to promote those plants. So it's the total flip of what your recommendations or prescriptions are going to be on that bass side. So
now, in a perfect world, let's say you're not space limited and you're not financially limited. There are things you can do with your lake that can benefit both. For example, let's say you have a 20-acre lake that is pretty effective at growing fish, and it probably, we'll get into diving ducks and dabbling ducks and all that in a little bit, but let's say it attracts diving ducks because they do like open water to some extent and they eat fish to some extent. But you have a fairly large forested downstream area. You could still do a pond drawdown in the wintertime and flood that forest below if you put in a small levee system and have the best of both worlds. But that is, most of us don't have that luxury of having unlimited space and funds to do that. But in that case, Brian, when is the best time to flood timber like that, and how long should you keep it flooded before you have to worry about potentially hurting the timber?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do know a lot about that, and we, since the 1930s, when we've been managing green tree reservoirs, really beginning in Arkansas, we traditionally put water on at the same time, usually in November, and then we pull it off after the duck season. And realistically, bottom and hardwoods really haven't evolved in that system. When you look at rainfall gauges, rainfall patterns, it almost looks like a heartbeat. It's not always dry or it's not always wet. And so what we've done with some of these forested wetlands is we pull water up before duck season, leave it at a certain level, and then pull it off. And so what we've done, and it's taken really decades to do it, is we've shifted some of the bottom and hardwood forest from more of these red oak. There's really the 4 species of oaks that really provide ducks with good acorn crops are willow, water, cherry bark, and nuttall oak. And in a lot of places in both Mississippi and Arkansas, in the Delta regions, we really shifted some of those red oaks in some places to more overcup oak, which is a lot more water tolerant. So we need to be mindful about, and I tell, in this past year was a perfect example. It was horrible for the duck hunters, right? It was just so dry. But like I told my friends and people, I'm like, this is the best thing ecologically that could happen to bottom of hardwood forests, is they basically were dry all winter long. It's like they got a chance to dry out. And a lot of times it's kind of a misnomer, but one of the great things about wetlands, especially if you design a wetland, is that you want it to go dry. As weird as that sounds, for the most part, even semi-permanent type of wetlands, all over North America, when they get a chance to kind of dry out, it recharges nutrients. The soils get a chance to breathe. It's just kind of like having new life. And so this year, even though, duck hunters are really frustrated, there wasn't any water, it was the greatest thing that could have happened for the woods. So I'll just say that. But getting back to the other question, about the pond type, let me say a couple things. One, you're right, the size. Typically, the larger the size, the better, not always. And then the other expectations we need to have is ask yourself, where are your ponds? So obviously, eastern Mississippi is much different than the Delta. some of these smaller, maybe backyard ponds on the eastern side of the state, you may see, some visits from wood ducks and gadwall and ringneck ducks, especially in the spring. And sometimes they're not just there to eat either. Sometimes they just go there to roost and loaf and maybe roost at night, whatever. So it's not always food driven, but food can help. And then if those are in the Delta, again, you may have a lot more visitation because typically there's just more ducks around. If they're around, the chance of those being visited are probably higher. And in thinking about the ducks themselves, what landowners need to know is we have birds that are, really kind of hardcore seed eaters like northern pintail, green-winged teal. Mallards are seed eaters, but mallards will eat fish during winter and on spring migration. So they'll eat a lot of stuff. The other component to that is gadwall, and their gadwall and American widgeon are what we consider our most vegetarian of the ducks world. So in terms of your ponds, and I myself have participated in some studies, we looked at different submerged aquatic plants, and there's something that we study called true metabolizable energy. What that basically means is, hey, does food X, Y, or Z provide birds with any nutrition? Is it palatable and things like that? And so some of the studies, one of which was actually done in captivity in Illinois at the Illinois Natural History Survey just a couple of years ago. We looked at coontail, southern naiad, sago pondweed, and Eurasian water milfoil. Those are some of the big ones. And basically all those were pretty good for the most part. And then we found actually that coontail and Canadian waterweed actually provided energy. They were both beneficial to both mallards and gadwall. So in your ponds, I'm not going to say you're not going to have seed eaters like mallards. I mean, mallards are generalists, so you'll probably see mallards on your pond. Wood ducks, you'll see pairs drop in there, and again, whether they're eating or not, you may be able to use those. But given some of the submerged aquatic plants, if you can promote those, there is a good chance you might be able to attract gadwall. The other thing I'll mention too is if you do draw down, a lot of times, people like a clean looking pond, they want everything mowed around the edges and things like that. But the dirtier it is, the more weedy it is, those things can provide seed sources to ducks. The other thing is the more vegetation you have within reason, you're typically going to produce aquatic invertebrates because the invertebrates, they need like the algae that may cling to the plants, and they use the microenvironments of the plant stems and things like that, or they'll actually use the leaf structure of a lot of plants for their own forage. And so then you generate these bug communities, and then the ducks come in to feed on the bugs. And so the last thing I'll mention is the age-old question is like, what makes a good gadwall break, like Oxbow Lake or break, and a good fishing lake? And we know that it seems like when there's plants like duckweeds, the different types of duckweeds, when they're growing on the surface of the water, gadwall tend to show up. But I think that'd be a really cool, kind of a future research project to ask those questions. Maybe it's water quality, size, structure, but no doubt probably the plant community. And again, some of those plants I mentioned, duckweeds, things like that, those can be really beneficial to gadwall. Sometimes American widgeon, you could attract some that way. So
you said a lot there, and I'd like to unpack a little bit of it. First of all, I was very surprised when you said the 4 species of oaks that ducks prefer to eat are the ones that are the least tolerant of consistent flooding. I thought that was kind of surprising to me. I guess they're designed to be near water, but not in water, or in water for a much shorter period of time, I guess.
Yes, they've evolved to just have periodic. And I do this with the students in my classes. I'll give them various definitions of bottomland hardwood forest. And in the words that always show up or best describe them are infrequent flooding, periodic flooding. If you think of like a heart monitor where it's up and down, up and down, up and down, like a heartbeat, that's kind of what our hydrology, across years. I mean, some years are really, really wet. Some years are really, really dry, like this last year. But on average, typically you'll get, a little bit of overbank flood, then it recedes. So you get these variable water depths. And so forested areas that don't have big levees around them, water can kind of come and go. I mean, if the water's up so high, obviously they're going to be, sometimes they're flooded in the summer, right? There's nothing we can do about it. But typically, if you get overbank floods or backwater floods in areas that don't have big levees, eventually that water recedes. And what we've done with green tree reservoirs, a green tree reservoir is basically a forested wetland with a levee around it. These began in the 1930s in the Arkansas Grand Prairie as a way to hold water for rice. And then they figured out, hey, the ducks, love to come in these things. And so, green tree hunting was born and, many decades ago. So, if you lose that periodic flooding, then you tend to promote trees that are, more flood water tolerant. And I'll tell you, to use Arkansas as an example, we had a kind of a landowner wetland workshop, I guess 2 summers ago now, and we all toured Biomeda, and a lot of listeners are aware of Biomeda. It's like a 32,000 acre bottomland hardwood forest. It's just been flooded for too long and too deeply, and the forest conditions have really digressed over the decades, and they are spending, I think this number's correct, in Biomeda alone, they're going to put in something like 7 or 8 new water control structures, and each one of those is like $7 million. That's how serious they're taking water management. And so Arkansas is actually going through just a major sort of revisitation and restoration of bottomland hardwood forests. A lot of these green tree reservoirs, they're going to improve flood and drain capacity, because you can kill trees by flooding too early, and you can kill trees by having the water on too late. So generally, I tell people sort of the drop dead date, if you will, is like March 1st. Don't go beyond that. But look at budding and leaf out. That kind of let the trees tell you what's going on. So if you start to see them bud out in an early spring, you got to get the water off of them.
And you don't necessarily need to have the trees flooded, right? I mean, a lot of times you can have a water body with say a pin oak or whatever, a nuttall oak right beside the water body. Not only will the acorns fall in the water where the ducks can get them, but the ducks will walk out on the bank. I mean, I remember hunting down the Delta and being beside a slough and seeing just hundreds of wood ducks coming up out of the slough and walking around on the ground underneath me, feeding on acorns. So it all depends on your terrain, I guess. But the other thing you said that was really interesting was the fact that, it depends on where you're located. Obviously, you're not going to do some property management on your 40-acre tract with your 10-acre pond in western Alabama and expect it to be like Stuttgart, Arkansas, right? I mean, you're not on the flyway. You don't have that type of terrain. The other thing before we move back to the pond itself, I wanted to bring up, which is using the pond to flood other property, is it doesn't have to be forested property. James, what are some things people could plant downstream and flood to really attract ducks?
Yeah, I've seen that used. There's actually some on some of the public lands. Noxubee utilizes that same kind of technique of having a fishing area, reservoir, and then there's waterfowl impoundments at a lower elevation down below it, and they actually use that source of surface water from the pond when they're drawing down in winter to flood those areas. And I've had several other landowners I've worked with kind of have that same setup. They had some low-lying areas lower in the lower elevation below where their pond levee was, and constructed up some levees to create an impoundment. And so they were able to flood that and then manage the water levels in that lower impoundment independent of the pond when they drained that in the spring real slow to promote the growth of the grasses and sedges and all those plants that Brian had mentioned earlier. You can also, obviously, like you said, plant something. Millet's a common thing, that folks do supplemental planting, particularly because the soil disturbance, the disking and the water drawdown and all, that's a pretty complex thing to get your head wrapped around, and it's different from every site. So sometimes with all of our best efforts, depending on what Mother Nature throws at you during the spring and summer months, it may change those conditions and you don't get the plants you want. For sure, disking those areas and planting something like Japanese or brown top millet. If it's a wetter site, you can broadcast Japanese millet on a disc site or a mud flat type site. If it's a little drier, you could do that same type of thing with brown top millet, just broadcast it. Or if it's a site you kind of don't know what it's going to do, it might get some rain, might be a little wet, you can hedge your bets and kind of do a 50-50 mix. If you don't know if it's going to get real dry or real wet, and you can hedge your bets that way and get a good stand of millet of those two types that can work well on either of the, have a little bit of both, can work in either of those conditions. So millet's a common thing folks plant, but definitely that strategy of if you do have an area below that you need to get water and flood, using that fishing pond as a source of that water, because that's a big thing folks have trouble with, is like, if I built an impoundment, am I going to have to wait for rainfall to fill this up? And so having that pond, being able to use that surface water source, because depending on where you are, if you wanted to have a pump, if you're pumping groundwater, that can be a pretty expensive endeavor. How far down deep do you have to dig and all that? So a surface water source like a pond is a really cool way to have that if you have that situation.
Hey, can I add to that real quick?
Sure.
James, did you mention Chihuahua millet?
I haven't. I did not mention that one, but that is another option. That one's a real prolific seed producer.
Yeah, so for the listeners, it's spelled Chiwapa, Chihuahua, and it grows really tall. And one of the advantages of that is that if you've got areas that are pretty wet, somewhat flood prone, that seems to do well with some of that flooding. So a lot of these plants James was mentioning is, unlike submerged or floating aquatics in your pond that can stay basically in that water environment, these emergent seasonal plants that we're talking about, the seed producers, you can't flood over the top of them for very long because they respire, through the top of the plant, the flowers and all that. So they've got to be above water. So what's neat about Chihuahua, if it gets established and you've got a flood, it can grow through the water. And typically, if the water is about halfway up on the stem or less, it typically can be okay. You don't want the water over top the plant because it'll basically kill it. So Chihuahua is good because it gets really tall. And so if you do have areas or edges of ponds that may be, a foot or two deep, unlike a typical moist soil impoundment, it might be worth trying that. And there's different sources. It's not really highly available like Japanese millet or some of the other millet types, but eventually we can get, if people are interested, I can find and get the source for some of the seed. They're trying to make more of it, basically create more availability for it, but it can be really good in those areas that may be a little flood prone or a little bit deeper, because it'll get really tall. I mean, it'll grow over your head, and then you end up having to mow some of it if it gets too thick and too dense. But that's a better problem to have than nothing. So
yeah, that's what I'll add to that is about Chihuahua millet. I think it's great in those situations that Brian was talking about, and that may be a good thing for in your farm pond. If you can have be able to do that on the edge, and like I said earlier, it's a real prolific seed producer, probably more so than the Japanese and the brown top millet. So it does provide a lot of food, but as far as if you were going to do a large area of it, because it does get so tall and kind of rank, robust vegetation, thinking about it in terms of waterfowl being able to access that, you wouldn't want the whole area. Like, it produces a ton of seed, and it also, too, though, that tall provides that cover and provides hunter cover, too. You might be able to hide a little bit in some of that, too. So I think it'd be real great for along the edge of a pond. But if I was doing it in a whole food plot area, it would be that component where that site was right. Like Brian was saying, you got those conditions, it'd be really good for that. If you planted it, it's something you can't manipulate. You couldn't mow it. So if it was real robust and you're like, well, ducks aren't going to be able to get in here and access it until it lays over, after I flood it for a while, you can't go in there and mow something in the year that you planted it, because you're creating kind of a baited situation then. So you couldn't
good point,
manipulate it.
James. Yeah.
So you want to. That's why when I've recommended it before in the past, I'm saying just put it in these places where we know it'll do well, and you'll get that extra seed production, you'll get that cover, but you'll still have waterfowl access. Ducks will still be able to get in there.
So a question is, when would you plant this millet? What time of year?
There's mostly overlapping across all of them, and for those seeding dates, usually kind of over in your late summer, July, August, on into a little bit into September, maybe in some places, you still have enough growing season left. And it's kind of dependent on each one. So like Japanese millet, I think has about a 90-day maturation period. Brown top is like 60. I can't really recall on Chihuahua off the top of my head, but looking at whatever the maturity date for those are, don't get yourself in that risky area where we're getting close to frost. You don't want it to still be growing at that point. So usually around July is the time where most folks are going to be establishing those food plots for all three of those species of millet.
So for within pond management, wouldn't it be possible then, especially like this past year where we had one of our worst droughts in a while and a lot of ponds were down 2, 3, 4 feet, could you come in, maybe plant the Chihuahua millet in the upper portions of the lake in the deeper areas, and then maybe plant Japanese brown top millet along the edges? And then when you do get flooding again, say November, December.
Yeah, because then your Chihuahua might still grow if you get a little bit of that water, like Brian said, to that extent that he was talking about. Even if you got the plant up a little bit, might still have that. And if you still had those more mud flat, wetter conditions, that Japanese would be fine in those more shallower places. But yeah, if there's a mud flat that exists, broadcasting Japanese millet on that during those conditions in late summer is a perfect way to do it. If you have those conditions, do July broadcast on those for that Japanese would be great. Like I said, if you think it might reflood that Chihuahua, like Brian was talking about, big good opportunity to include some food plots in the edge of your fish pond for sure.
But again, you're relying on Mother Nature to reflood this at the right time of year. And if I've learned anything about the weather lately, it never cooperates. So,
no, some state agencies, they've had a tradition of actually these big flood control reservoirs. Of course, that's different from a backyard pond and all that. But some state wildlife agencies, they'll fly a fixed wing airplane over these coves and things in these reservoirs, and they'll seed the mud flat. So it's pretty cool. And I've hunted in those places in the fall. And, if the water levels are just right, I mean, they got a pretty good idea of when it's going to flood and how deep. So they do a really good job of doing that and establishing a plant base. And so typically, ducks or the dabbling ducks anyway are going to be feeding in kind of the fringe areas, where kind of the golden rule for mallards is 18 inches of water or less. Honestly, if ducks aren't disturbed and we're not chasing them, ducks do very well walking through the water, walking on mud flats. And it's funny, you mentioned the wood ducks and that walking earlier, Wes. Wood duck's legs are spaced on its body closer than like any other dabbling. It's a perching duck, but any other dabbling duck, because they do so well walking. And I don't know how many people have told me in the past, they've seen them just come crashing through the woods and walk, walking up a hill, scarfing acorns. And so it's interesting, some people like, do mallards still eat acorns? And my sugar-coated answer is yes, very much so. Part of the issue, though, is that if you get a chance to watch birds that aren't disturbed, you just happen upon a place and nobody's been hunting there for a while, it's amazing how ducks love to get out of the water. They love to walk around. They'll walk around on dry ground. They'll forage in mud. We just don't get to see that very often because, one, typically we flood everything too deep for the most part. And two, we're chasing birds so much through hunting that, as I like to joke, a lot of times we don't get to see ducks be ducks. And when ducks get to be ducks, you'd be astounded at what they do. I mean, they sit up on logs, they'll walk around, again, like on dry ground, a mud flat, things like that. We just don't, a lot of times we don't give them that chance. But if you get a chance to see them, yeah, they're pretty amazing.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's WES, .Neal, that's NEAL, at Mississippi State, that's MSSTATE, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
It's interesting. We've been talking for the most part to this point, I think largely about dabbling ducks, to some extent about wood ducks. But one thing that ponds, these larger lakes and ponds that are deeper, can be relatively effective at attracting are the diving ducks. And I know a lot of people, really the avid duck hunters, don't necessarily think of diving ducks as ducks. I don't know what's wrong with them. But, things like scaup, things like canvasbacks and other species, I see these on larger or even smaller lakes a lot, doing quite well in open water without any vegetation. What can we do to try to make these lakes more attractive to diving ducks?
Yeah, what's really cool. So let's think about these, and sort of like the dabbling ducks. We've got, get back to the dabbling ducks real fast. You got generalists like mallards, and then we have like heavy seed eaters like green-winged teal, and then we have the vegetarians, the gadwall and the American widgeon, and then we have hardcore carnivores. Basically, they eat bugs. That's like the northern shoveler, for example. So you have all these different, we refer to that as their life history. What do they, how many eggs do they lay? When do they nest? Where do they nest? What kind of foods do they eat? All those are all life history characteristics. And what's cool about the diving ducks is that we have kind of these specialists and generalists as well. And maybe I'll start with the most charismatic one, the canvasback. Its scientific name is Ithya vallisneria. And vallisneria is actually the same name, it's spelled differently, but for wild celery. And so historically, before we got here and messed everything up and changed water quality and all those kind of things, canvasbacks were just, they are a regal bird. People shoot a canvasback and it's all over social media. It's like, oh, I got a can, and some of their nicknames are king, king duck, and in the can, they're just really revered. And way back before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they were highly coveted in restaurants in the big cities like New York and Chicago. And when you could sell them, you look at old menus from old restaurants before hunting regulations, and canvasback was on the top of the list. And so they fulfilled a lot of their dietary needs in places like Chesapeake Bay, San Francisco Bay. Chesapeake Bay was just once chock full of beds of wild celery. We think of these plants as sort of the bottom up. It's like, it's what drives everything, right? All these productive plant communities like celery, for example, shrimp and crabs and fish, everything lives in there. And if we didn't have sort of that bottom up underworld plant community, it's what's so different about the diving ducks and their food needs is that we don't really see them, right? So we can see obviously a flooded forest with piles of mallards and wood ducks going into them. That's easy, right? Flooded cornfields and moist soil, those are easy to see ducks piling into them. So we really, you can do, 1 and 1 is 2 really easily. But when you see a bunch of diving ducks out in the middle of this open water, you're like, what in the heck are they doing out there? And again, it's not always all about food. A lot of times, like scaup, for example, there were, rafts of those things. 1 million birds in a raft off Gulf Coast of Louisiana, 25 miles out in the Gulf. They're not necessarily foraging, they're just out there resting. But getting back to the food thing, so canvasbacks and wild celery. Another really cool charismatic duck, one of the first ones I killed when I was a kid, the redhead. Like 80 to 90% of our redheads in North America spend winter down around Matagorda Bay off the coast of Texas because of shoal grass. It's called halidule, and everybody's fearful because it's like, what if salinity changes or, climate changes and the shoal grass goes away? What's the plan B for the redhead, And so it's kind of this precarious situation, but kind of like the canvasback, shoal grass really drives the redheads. Scaup, kind of changing gears a little bit. Scaup are, and we talk about this in the animal world. If you really are a perfectionist at one thing, you got it made. As long as that food source or that nesting site is still available. If you capitalize on that, not many other species use it like you do, you're pretty much golden, right? And so scaup have basically evolved. Scaup have a variety of food items that they eat, but they really have kind of honed in on amphipods, tiny shrimp up and down the flyway. So scaup will nest in Alaska. They'll nest in the boreal forest, in the prairies, fairly widespread. And they've sort of made their living on amphipods, these tiny shrimp. And it's not to say that they don't eat other things. They do. And other birds eat shrimp. We know that. But they really have kind of, in terms of life history characteristics, kind of set themselves apart from redheads and canvasbacks. And then the last one I'll say, ringneck ducks. They're kind of another blue and white black bird like the scaup. But man, the population trajectories on those two are totally different. Ringnecks are, I would argue, a lot more habitat generalist. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up hunting Duck Creek, with my mom and dad in a duck blind and watching ringneck ducks swim through the woods with mallards. I'm like, what are these things doing here? I always joke that on the evolutionary tree, they're sort of part dabbler, part diver. So they'll eat a lot of things. I mean, people in Georgia flood cornfields because they love to shoot ringnecks. It's amazing. Very, very diverse diet. They'll eat all kinds of things. And that may be one of the reasons why we have so many ringnecks, is they've just done so well in terms of a diverse foraging base. They're kind of like a mallard. They're almost willing to eat anything. So that could be one of the reasons why ringneck ducks are doing well. Anyway, not to get off on a tangent, but it's really cool. Even within the diving ducks, there's some partitioning between the seed eaters and the bug eaters, if you will. And the other big thing I'll say about canvasback is that for a long time, and honestly, I should know this, maybe James does, I don't know what the winter population numbers are on Catahoula Lake, but when Chesapeake Bay, the water quality went to heck for a lot of reasons there, canvasbacks really shifted to Catahoula, and they made a living on nutsedge. So they'd pull up the tubers of those sedges out of the mud, and they're like baby baked potatoes. So again, fortunately, they adapted. They kind of shifted some of their dietary needs and did well. So,
and one thing with the canvasbacks is they're more of a large water body duck, right? So I mean,
what's really interesting is when and it's every year when I'm hunting in Arkansas, sometimes you get sort of those landscape rains and floods, and all of a sudden here comes some cans zipping. We'll be sitting in the pit, trying to hunt geese or something. It's like, oh man, those are cans, and you get all excited, like, oh, a little too far, you hope they come back. So they'll, not to say that they're adapted to agricultural lands, but when you get a lot of water on an ag landscape, a lot of times you'll see diving ducks. You'll see a few of them show up. So that's really, really cool. Yeah. Anyway, not to cut you off, but
oh no, I was just saying. But the one duck I do see a lot on smaller bodies of water and farm ponds and small lakes are the ringnecks you mentioned. So
yes.
So let's talk about what can the landowner do to try to encourage using farm ponds and medium-sized lakes for things like ringnecks, potentially scaup, or other diving ducks?
So yeah, like ringneck's a good example, Wes, and like kind of what Brian said, ringnecks are one of those divers that, like I always say, they want so badly to be a dabbling duck, just with their food habits and such. They're kind of a deep water dabbler. They eat a lot of seeds, tubers, eat plant matter, all that sort of thing. So they use a lot of places that dabblers use. And so I think if you have, for a species like that, if you're managing kind of towards like a gadwall and puddle duck side of things, you've got some submerged aquatics, and then you've got some of those seed producers, on the edge. Definitely, I would encourage diving ducks like ringnecks to use. I think as far as it'd be difficult to manage for some of the particular, like with a focused management on some of the other, diving ducks. But if you did have some of those submerged aquatic vegetation beds and some vegetation, some sedges and things on the edge, it may create the conditions that have a lot of those bug component. And so you might see more of your divers responding to the critters that make their home in some of that other type of vegetation communities, in the system there. Things like those aquatic invertebrates, and in some ponds too, I'm sure scaup respond if conditions are right, where there's some little mussel type things, or snails and things like that. They'll eat some of those food resources as well. Ruddy ducks are another one you see a lot on farm ponds, and they eat a lot of worms and stuff down in the substrate, kind of feeding in some of those same places that probably like your catfish are getting into down there on the bottom and whatnot. But it's tough to think of managing for those diving ducks in a pond the same way, that you do. Maybe it's just a benefit of the other management you're doing on the pond that provides some of those, like I said, those plant communities that may provide some of those other resources that divers use. And of course, you have hooded mergansers and things like that that'll use ponds. Of course, they're eating, some of the fish in those ponds. But I don't really have a lot of suggestions for like how to make more canvasbacks show up to your pond. It's more about if those conditions are right, they will. But yeah, the canvasbacks, there's a lot of interesting stuff, like Brian said, for sure on some of these birds and what they've responded to, and maybe the changes in the availability of those resources and how it's shifted where those individuals are distributed. Like you said, Catahoula Lake, it's kind of crazy. Remember to think about what the total population numbers of canvasbacks are, and then how much proportion that they would report on that one lake. Like, we don't think about all the other ducks. You see a count, aerial survey of an area, and for most of them, it's probably a fairly small percentage of the total ducks of that species. But someplace like Catahoula Lake, where you can actually see a pretty large percentage of the total canvasback population sitting in this one wintering area, it's pretty crazy to think about those resources driving that distribution to that level.
Well, to this point, we've been talking about food and attracting them with what they eat, but what are some other things that can be done to make ducks more likely to visit, to check it out, to see if the food resources are there, make them feel more comfortable? I'm thinking, a nice manicured lawn leading down to the pond edge with a giant house and a boat dock's probably not the most attractive to a migrating waterfowl.
It's pretty attractive to a resident Canada goose, though.
Yeah, well, we were going to get there in a second. When we were talking about attracting geese is not nearly as difficult. But what can someone do if they want to have migratory waterfowl stop in?
Yeah, for sure. It depends on the site that you have. It's much more likely that the pond out in the pasture or somewhere else on the property away from the busy, high disturbance nature of a pond right behind the house, it's going to be more attractive. And that's just more of a result, not as much of how it looks. Birds may stop into it even with all that, the house and all the other structures around it, but they may not hang around long because of the level of disturbance. People walk, come out, scare them away, that sort of thing. And they're just less disturbance is probably more what's going to drive them to choose that other pond, and stay there. Certainly, I think you got a pond way down the hill from your house, you can still see it. As long as your people or your pets aren't scaring them away, ducks will still pop in and use that. I don't think it's a huge deterrent that it's close to human structures. It's just, is it far enough away where they feel safe and will stay there? But if you are close, there are obviously some things you could probably do to probably put some screening between you and the pond, maybe, that could help that to some extent. But I think just that level of human disturbance definitely plays a role in how quality it will be to have them stay there and utilize it long term.
And all animals are always balancing the risk versus reward. If it's unbelievable feeding habitat, they probably will come back if you scare them off a couple of times. But if it's mediocre to poor feeding habitat and you scare them away, well, they may just go find someplace else. So
exactly.
A lot of it does come back to food.
It does.
Well, you mentioned geese. And Canada geese, we've talked about them a little bit, but with Canada geese, that's the one bird that we can't seem to keep away from our small ponds and lakes. Usually we're talking about resident birds, not so much as the migratory birds. Let's talk about them a little bit, and what do geese like, and what attracts them to our lakes, and how can we potentially keep them away or attract the migratory ones?
Good luck keeping them away. Yeah, most of these Canada geese anymore are locals. Historically, way back, Canada geese migrated here. And one of the hypotheses for their long neck is that they evolved in moist soil habitats. It was a way to reach seeds at different water depths and pull seeds off of seed heads and things like that. Whether that's really true, it's plausible. You think about pre-agriculture, but now they've just done so well, kind of like deer and snow geese. They've just done so well with with urban areas, anthropogenic habitats, agriculture, wheat, corn, and grass. Canada geese I kind of joke with my students, I'm like, they're sort of like the lawnmower. They love to clip. They don't really pull as much as like a snow goose would. They'll pull the roots and things of plants up with their bill, but Canada geese they'll clip the yard, and typically they're feeding on really short plant shoots, the green browse. Usually the protein is highest in the top like half inch or so of the plant. And then the other reason they don't like really tall grass is, from predators, they like to be able to see and things like that. So basically where there's open pond banks, of course, golf courses, kind of the running joke all over the place, the golf course geese. There have been, and I should have prepared better on this, there's been some sort of grass spray treatments for aversions and things like that. But really, at the end of the day, there really hasn't been anything that's been real tried and true, I guess, in terms of deterring them. But yeah, they're kind of like a deer with wings. They can almost live anywhere. They'll eat basically anything. So yeah, if they're around, we're going to have them. Some people in the past they've taken the eggs, to try to cut down on reproduction. The problem with geese, unlike ducks, is that the most important piece of the population, if you will, that drives population growth is the survival of the adult female in geese. That's one reason why we have so many snow geese, is that hunters can't harvest enough of them. And Canada geese are a lot of the same way. Geese pair for life. They're older. They have delayed reproduction, but the males hang out with the females, and survival of the female goose can be really high, and that's really what drives the population. Ducks only live to be a few years old, and so what happens in the breeding grounds really drives their populations. Like red foxes and various predators either eat the eggs and or the female. But geese, that's one reason why they do so well, is they're very adaptable. And then the females and the males, the adults have really good survival rates. So that's kind of one of the drivers of the population.
And there's one thing that you can do to try to deter geese from your pond, and that's shoot them, right?
Well, that's exactly right. Now we have these early seasons, September, and back when I had more time as a grad student, we'd drive about a half hour from campus east and go find some Corps of Engineer land. And yeah, there's times they'll drop right in on you. And yep.
Yeah, if you disturb them in your property enough that they will eventually try to find someplace that's a little bit safer. But that brings me to my next question. When it comes to managing for ducks, depending on the pond size, I realize that's an issue, but how often can a landowner expect to be able to hunt on their small pond before the disturbance is preventing the ducks from coming back?
That's a question I get all the time, and like a lot of questions, the answer is it depends. You kind of have to feel out what that is, but typically, I think it's pretty safe to say the more days of consecutive rest that they have, the higher likelihood that they're going to stay and it can sustain a more regular, hunting, So if you're hunting it once a week, pretty good bet that most places, can handle that. If you have abundant birds, that's another thing. How many ducks do you have showing up to the place? If it's just a handful of birds coming in there every day, that's probably a one hunt a week or less even type of situation. But if you have super abundant birds showing up and you could hunt more frequently, I think the rule of thumb is the fewer times of consecutive hunting days, the better. So if you kind of put some days of break between, and like I said, that's going to highly depend on the site and how many birds are utilizing it. If that's a Saturday and Wednesday type hunting schedule, or if you can get away with a little bit more frequency than that, but trying to avoid hunting multiple days in a row. That consecutive pressure is what's going to push birds out. Having some amount of rest in there of consecutive days of rest, I think, is going to influence most of the research that we've done on this with some of the public areas and such. Have shown differences in hunting 2 versus 4 days a week, and then the type of birds that are made up in those. Like if you're only hunting a place 2 days a week, seem to be harvesting more mallards or bigger ducks, and versus hunting 4 days a week, you may have some similar success rates, but it's not as many mallards. Some of the other birds, more shoveler, teal, things like that. But definitely the main thing coming out of most of that work has been that, if you put more consecutive days of rest in there, the better success you're going to have in hunting, and less likely that you're going to push birds out. But how many days that is, I think, is really just going to depend on the site, and kind of have to be a trial and error on the landowner's part of seeing how much they can get away with there.
Yeah, this is a whole nother podcast probably, but I know we don't have a lot of time, but James is absolutely right. And it's just one of those things you really have to monitor your place and just see. I mean, there are some places where until they leave, wood ducks are going to show up for 20 minutes right at daylight or a half hour before, and you can kind of cash in on them. There's other times dabbling ducks may show, gadwall may show up, but if you're not really food driven and prepared for them, you can knock them out in a hurry. 1-2 days a week. I mean, even with really good moist soil. But on the other hand, I'll tell you, I've seen some crazy things. I didn't really believe this until I saw it, but down there, I've got friends down there in Shreveport, Louisiana. This is a number of years ago, but my friends, he said, he's like, Brian, you got to come and hunt this gadwall break. He said, it's unbelievable. I mean, they just come in there nonstop. And I'm like, okay. So we go, and it's basically like an old oxbow. I mean, you can almost walk across it. You can shoot, you toss a baseball over it. It's narrow. And for whatever reason, the nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever, it's just always loaded with duckweed. And those gadwall, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I hate to say you couldn't shoot them out of it, but basically until that food was gone, they would come in there every morning. And these landowners, I mean, that's what they hunted. They basically sat up in the trees on the bank of this thing, and these gadwall would just jet down from the heavens and come right into this narrow old break, that had a bunch of at least duckweed. There may have been other things they were after. And I'm talking like these people would shoot many, many hundreds of ducks a season. I think maybe even 1,000 one year. I can't remember the number, but I'm like, holy smokes. I mean, this is just, you almost had to do it. We hunted there one morning in a driving, pouring rainstorm, and just gadwall were nonstop. It was crazy. So I say that, you're better off erring on the side of being more conservative, fewer days per week. But sometimes in situations like this break with duckweed and whatever other food, maybe just because of where it was on the landscape, I've never seen anything like it. It was the most unbelievable gadwall hunting I've ever seen in my life. So again, it all depends. There's really no magic recipe. You really have to gauge your spot. Where are you? What kind of food? It doesn't take you long to figure it out. The other thing I'll say is, if you get a massive weather day, let's say, I'm not supposed to hunt. It's Tuesday. I'm not supposed to hunt till tomorrow. Man, if you get a cold front, especially as wonky as the weather is, if it's really cold and the wind's blowing, I'd say go take advantage of it. It's those days where the wind kind of stalls and it's cloudy and kind of calm. You might as well just go to the house, just rest it on those days. But a lot of times if you're getting flight ducks, and the weather's kind of wonky and nasty, I'd go for it. Hunt that morning and then let it rest, Wednesday or whatever. Anyway, so no magic formula really. It's all so site dependent. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
I have one more quick question for you guys. I want to try to keep our listeners as legal as possible. Obviously, they've got to follow federal regulations and use non-toxic shot and have a plug in your gun and all that. But a lot of these lakes may have feeders on them. They're feeding fish food. Maybe they're not feeding during the winter. Maybe they're not feeding during duck season. But do you guys have any idea what the legalities of having a feeder, say, 200 yards from your duck hole would be? Or is it a better question for the game warden?
I would say that's much more of a question for a law enforcement professional answer that. I haven't thought about it in this terms. I've had that question asked to me about like aquaculture, ponds, production ponds. And that's kind of normal agricultural practice. That's part of that production system type thing. And I'm sure that ducks may consume some of that. I don't know if that's a huge, attractant or not, but yeah, I think that's one of those that somebody who's more into the law enforcement side could address that question. I don't want to get anybody in trouble with my speculation on that topic.
Gotcha.
Yeah, for sure. The one thing I'll add to that, we had a Stephen Clements, who's actually my PhD student, but for his master's work, he studied scaup using bait fish farms in Arkansas, and was really interesting. The premise is that, the scaup show up and they eat all our fish. And what we actually found is he had 2 winters, like 2016, 17, I can't remember the years now, but one winter was pretty mild and the other one was pretty harsh. So it was kind of a neat comparison. But in the milder winter, so what he was doing is watching birds, counting them. We had this real rigorous survey technique, blah, 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 and then we would shoot some. And so when he looked at all the food contents from the throat all the way down through the gizzard. And so what we found in the milder winter is that, they really weren't eating a lot of fish. Very few birds actually had fish, but they were loaded with what we call these chironomids. They look like mosquitoes when they're in the air. There'll be little red worms, and then they'll fledge into these people think they're mosquitoes, but they're really these midges. And so they would eat a lot of chironomids. And then in the second winter, when it was really cold, the consumption of fish did go up. And there were various reasons for that. It could be that the fish maybe were more lethargic and the birds were able to capture them easier, or perhaps the scaup targeted fish more so then because of the richness of the fats and all the nutrients associated with fish. So we couldn't really tease those things apart, like what really drove them to do that. But a couple of points. One is scaup aren't always eating your fish on your aquaculture ponds. Depends on the winter, and especially in milder winters, they're actually eating a lot more bugs. And then point number 2, getting back to the foods that neither James or I have no idea. I'd be happy to answer for the listeners, but I have no clue. You definitely need to talk to a conservation agent about that. But the other point to that is that Stephen, he did actually found aquatic plant seeds in the scaup that he collected, but we didn't find any of the fish food bait in the scaup. So lots and lots of bugs in a mild winter. And then, yes, we had like maybe 20% of the birds consume fish in the second winter when it was colder, but still not tons of. So in terms of those with fish ponds like that, one of our recommendations is don't spend your time and money in kind of a warmer, milder winter because the scaup really aren't eating as many fish as you think. Now in the colder winter, yeah, so maybe that was one of our recommendations from those papers was save your resources, time and money, for the colder winters when the birds seem to be targeting the fish.
Well, guys, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I want to tell both of you I appreciate you coming on today, taking some time from your busy schedules and talking to us about ducks. I think in general, the consensus was anything you can do to make more food for ducks without hurting the fish population seems like the way to go. So unless you have any parting thoughts, I want to say thanks to both of you for coming on today.
Thanks for having us, Wes.
Yeah, lots of fun. Appreciate it. And we'll do it again.
And thanks, everybody, for listening to Fish University. I hope you come back next time for another interesting topic.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.